I'm back. So on March 15th, their sale, the 300 units, they would say was all from March 14th's $15 group because they would go to the most recently purchased until that ran out.
Gotcha.
So LIFO, the March 15 sale would be 300 at $15. That would leave them 50 of those, and they still have the 50 of the $10 group. Then they buy a whole bunch more in July, and then in October they sell 430 units. So the October sale would come also only from the $20 group because it was the most recently purchased. That makes some kind of sense?
Yes.
Okay. There are a couple other methods. These are by far the most common.
Okay.
But the next one would be exercise 8. And it actually makes you look back at exercise 7. It says use all the data from there. Mm-hmm. But it's called specific identification. It's used by companies that have a lot of things that are very expensive. Is generally who uses it, like a jewelry store or a car dealership. They have very expensive merchandise. They know that particular item, all about it, when they bought it, what they paid for it. They have maybe, like a car has a VIN number, a vehicle identification number. So if you ask them, what's the cost of that car you just sold? Oh, they know exactly what they paid for that one. They don't get them all confused. Exercise 7 here with these items that are $10 or $15, they probably are real generic and nobody cares which box or case it came out of. Right. So specific identification, if they give you problems like that, they will tell you which ones were sold. So you don't have to make a decision based on an assumption like LIFO or FIFO. So you can see exercise 8 says, at the very end of the month, or year, there were 45 units from March still left, 75 from the July stuff, and 100 from the October stuff. So your assumption is if that's all that's left, all the rest of it was sold. So to figure cost of goods sold, you just sort it into 2 piles. You take the 45 from the March 14th, and that was $15 a piece. Put that in the ending inventory category. And you'd say, well, they didn't mention it at all, the beginning inventory, so must be all of those are sold. And the rest of the March stuff would be sold, and you'd work your way down into what's sold and what's still here. So specific identification actually works out pretty easy because they hand you the numbers, or at least tell you which ones were sold. Okay. There's one other one, and that's an average, a weighted average. The weighted average says, look at what's in inventory at that moment. So for the March 15th sale, we would say, what's in inventory? Well, there would be 50 at $10 on hand right then, and 350 at $15. So we total it up and say there's a total of 400 products. And then we'd have to do the math to find out how many dollars that represents. This is 500, and I have no idea. 2 times 15, 52.50. So there's $5,750 worth of merchandise in the store when we make the March 15th sale. So we divide and find an average price. And you know the average is going to come between 10 and 15. It's really just an average of them.
Divided by what? The number of items?
Yeah, so you're going to take 5750 divided by 400. Okay. So 5750 divided by 400, and we're going to get $14.38. It's in the middle between the lowest and the highest, the 10 and the 15, but it's much heavier, much closer to 15 because we have so many more products at $15 than we do at $10.
Gotcha.
So we call this the average price. So when we say the cost of goods sold for the March 15th purchase or sale, we would say we sold 300 products at a cost of $14.38. We would just assume they all had that average price or that average original cost.
Okay.
Then when we move on to do the October sale, we would say out of 400, 300 of these were sold. So we would have 100 left at $14.38. So they no longer are thought of as $10 or $15 ones. They're all $14.38.
Okay.
And then in October, we would calculate another average of whatever's in there. It'd be 100 of them at $14.38 plus 450 of them at $20.
Right, because we could have bought something for a higher amount.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So every time we make a sale, we look and see if we need to re-average because there's new stuff in there.
Okay.
We just keep making an average every time we make a sale. And then that average price gets used for us to compute our cost of goods sold. There's not much more in the chapter. There's a lot about these methods. But do you want to get
of goods sold methods?
those methods, right? There's 4 of them: LIFO, FIFO, specific identification, and weighted average.
Okay.
Lower of cost or market is another thing you're going to encounter. And I'm going to go full screen on the textbook so we can see this a little easier. Exercise 10 at the bottom of the same page is a good example of this kind of problem. This happens when the company has some of its products on the store shelves that aren't worth what they used to be. They look at what they have. So this place has 4 products, how many of each one they have, what they paid for them when they bought them, and what they'd have to pay now if they wanted to buy more of them. So like helmets, they have 24 of them. They spent $50 for each one. If they had to restock today, it'd be $54, which is pretty typical. Prices tend to go up.
Yeah.
Bats, however, they spent $78 a piece for each bat, but now the prices are $72 each. So they've actually gone the other direction. Shoes have gone the other direction. They were $95, now they're down to $91, and uniforms have pretty much stayed the same. The rule about all our assets, including inventory, is that we ought to report them for what they cost us to buy. So that's why we put in equipment down for what we paid for it or any of our other assets. The problem is sometimes if we put them down for what we paid for them, we might be overstating it. If we say we have 17 bats at $78 each and we do that math, whatever that comes out to, that's probably too high a number. We might be misleading our readers because bats are really about $72 a piece now. So we say there's an exception to the cost rule. It's really that we should have them at the lowest of either the cost or the market price. So we would add another column over here in our chart and choose the lowest one. So for helmets, it's best that we keep them and put them at $50 a piece because that's the lower of cost or market. But bats, we should put at $72 a piece on our books because that's the lowest.
Okay.
So you go through and you'll actually do the multiplication. 24 times 50. Put that over here. 17 times 72 and put the number and so on. And then you'll come up with a grand total. The inventory should be this grand total, which is the lowest of each one.
And what is that column called?
Lower of cost or market, sometimes abbreviated LCM.
Okay.
That's pretty much chapter 6. They're going to run into a few extra things, but I think right now It's enough to absorb. And then we can worry about, okay, I conquered most of it, but I got a few questions.
Right.
I think that works better than just to keep dumping more on your brain.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay?
Yeah.
So please, we're kind of, and contact me when you get stuck on anything, and we can go back over something or talk about something we didn't really get into much.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay? And I'll post this video in a couple hours.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome. Good night.